Welcome to Old Path and our study through the book of 2 Kings. We make it to chapters 3 and 4 today. If I try to take on chapter 5, it's kind of too much to try to get in one study. So what we'll do is we'll handle these two chapters here, 3 and 4, and as kind of a way to bring us to where we are in the text. We have really seen the transition from the end of 1 Kings into 2. It's the transition of the ministry of Elijah and his time ministering up in Israel, in the northern parts of the division of the tribes, Judah to the south, Israel to the north. And this is where Elijah was doing the things that he was doing. Now, God has taken him, and Elisha is the person to take his place. So this is kind of a common thing that we'll see. God will remove one very, very high-profile person from the scene. In Elijah's case, it was quite miraculous. Other times, people would just come and go because of just they live their lives and then they pass on, but then there's someone to take their place. So in this case, you have that with Elisha. But from, I guess you could even say from Carmel onward, because of what happened with the prophets of Baal and everything that happened from there, Elijah was one of those people that is, again, larger than life. So if God is going to be passing that ministry of Elijah onto someone else, then of course there were going to have to be evidences, if you will, or miraculous things that would surround Elisha that would let people realize that he is in the pattern and in the mold of Elijah, the person that he had spent this time with. So, of course, if we would assume that's the case, we certainly see it in these chapters, and in a very quick way, very brief and just kind of matter of fact. Oh, by the way, a number of miraculous things are done at the hands of Elisha. And again, this would be, in my estimation, God's way of saying, it would be one thing if Elijah had left and Elisha just picked up his mantle and said, I'm the new guy. Well, if there's no evidence of that, then you're not that guy. You're just somebody who has taken that title onto yourself, but you're of no more importance than anyone else. You've just made yourself into something that you're not. So it really takes God to be the one who does the miraculous things, and he is the one who will produce the evidence, because let's face it, anything in the sense of the miraculous never comes by man. It obviously comes by God, at least as far as these kinds of, or this part of history, or even in the church. Now, is the devil able to do things supernaturally that we might consider as miraculous? Of course. Even in the future, we're told by what Paul says in 2 Thessalonians, he'll deceive countless people by signs and lying wonders. That's not God doing those things. That's the devil doing those things. And it will end up catapulting his man into a place of being able to do things that will draw a lot of attention to him and really forced worship. Ultimately, chapter 13 of Revelation helps us with that. So when we consider all of these things, it is important for us to recognize if this is a man who is doing and saying godly things, whether they're supportive of, say, the law that they would be under at this time, or if they're just calling wicked people back to either recognition of their wickedness and then ultimately to repentance, or in this case, as what Elisha does. He looks at a very wicked king and he calls him out for his wickedness and basically says, if it wasn't for that guy, Jehoshaphat, I wouldn't even be talking to you. That's a pretty heavy thing. So this is a guy who, again, has a great deal of authority, and it's really for two reasons. Clearly, this is the man who spent the time with Elijah, and Elijah really had no problems with allowing this man to kind of be around him and see these things taking place. So Elisha would be the one who picks up that mantle, and again, the identification that he was part of the ministry and around the things of Elijah, but it really recognizing this too. If a person is going to say those things, then miraculous things will follow him. If like with Elijah, so it would be with Elisha. It's exactly what we see in these chapters. Now again, they're presented to us very quickly, almost matter of fact, and they just kind of go from one thing to the next of historical accounts of events that took place. Some of them, honestly, here's the thing, you get to it and you can read the text, you can read what's in it. It's not a mystery. But why did God do the things that he did, and why did he do them in the way that he did them? Any Bible scholar, if they're going to, or any Bible teacher, or even a person reading them, will have to come to the conclusion, I have no idea why God did it like he did it. We have the account that it took place, but why did God do it like that? No idea. And it's not just that it's hidden to us because we weren't there and we don't have enough of the details. I don't care who was there. They're going to walk away from that and go, how did that happen and why was it done that way? Nobody knows. The only thing, in the biggest of the big picture, here's what you know. No one would take credit for it because it was done by some kind of hocus pocus type of thing. It's, as God does so very, very often, it's done in such an unorthodox manner so as to defy people being able to say, well, it was because of this prescription, or it was because of some natural cause. I mean, this makes absolutely no sense, some of these things. So I don't want to put it off too much longer because you're going to find that these are so very similar to a couple of instances in the New Testament as well. They're really, really cool. So chapter 3 of 2 Kings, let's have a word of prayer. Father, as we come to you, we pray that by your Holy Spirit, you would open our eyes to not only what is this history, but why this history matters, and even things that were taking place back then, that we would see very similar things and events happen in the New Testament. We would see that you have been doing these miraculous things all along, telling us a story that would lead us to the person of Jesus. And so we pray, God, that you would help us in our understanding, once again, open our eyes to these truths, and we ask, God, that you'd be glorified in our midst, and we ask it in Jesus' name. All right, so chapter 3 begins like this. Now, Jehoram, the son of Ahab, became king over Israel in Samaria in the 18th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and he reigned for 12 years. This is simply a way of identifying who was the king in the north versus the south, and the easiest way to do that is to build a timeline. And so you can say, here is when Jehoram began to reign, because we already know that Jehoshaphat is in place. Now, both of these guys are going to be involved in a situation that's coming up, but this is done kind of more as a housekeeping kind of a thing by the writer of 2 Kings, is to let me help you to understand when this happened historically in the timeline. And when I say 2 Kings, let's remember that 1st and 2nd Kings, even in a Jewish Bible today, is one volume. And of course, it's still seen as one volume. You see how quickly and seamlessly the end of 1st Kings works just perfectly with 2nd Kings. So it was a division, but it wasn't done separately. So it's pretty obvious. Now, it tells us this. So this Jehoram, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, but not like his father and mother, for he put away the sacred pillar of Baal and that his father had made. So this would be a great way of looking at, for whatever reason, why did he do this? We're not told. Was it that God prompted him? Well, if God prompted him, then he didn't follow through on the rest of what he should have done. So was this a man who then became, somehow a little better than his parents? Well, when your parents are Ahab and Jezebel, there's nowhere to go but up. So he may have torn down the pillars of these things, but when it says he did the things that Jeroboam had done, the first king in Israel, and the idolatry that took place, all of that was still going on. This is not a godly man. This is not a man who cared of the things of God. We're going to find that out here pretty quick. It doesn't take long. Nevertheless, he persisted in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, and he did not depart from them. So, again, we don't have a lot of detail on this. We can just extrapolate from what's put here. What we do know about Jeroboam was paranoid over the fact that if people would leave from the north to make pilgrimage down to Jerusalem, he felt he may lose the entire country. So he listens to very bad counsel. And so in the northernmost and the southernmost major cities territory of the northern tribes of Israel, in Bethel he puts up an altar, and he puts one up also in the city of Dan, and they institute the pagan calf worship that they had done from Egypt. So that persisted in the nation. Did he get credit for saying, I'll tear down the altars to Baal? Well, perhaps, but it's like a token gesture when the rest of the country is still absolutely subjected to idolatry. So it's really kind of an incidental thing. So verse 4 tells us this. Now, Mesha, the king of Moab, was a sheep herder, and he regularly paid the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. And it happened when Ahab died that the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. So again, is this seen as a weakened position? Is this the time to maybe try this? That's a pretty tough order. Every year you're having to give what is an immense amount of not only livestock, but then also of wool that you could end up selling or putting out in trade. Well, something, for whatever reason, he sees this as his opportunity. I'm going to go ahead and rebel against him. So King Jehoram went out of Samaria at that time, and he mustered all of Israel. Then he went and sent to Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, saying, the king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go with me and fight against Moab? And he said, I will go up. I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses. And then they said, which way shall we go? And then he answered, by the way of the wilderness of Edom. So Edom, if you think about it, when it comes to Edom and Moab and Ammon and all the rest of that, it is those are all of the succession of the it's Ammon and then Moab and then Edom. So it's from kind of north to south. But Moab would be the middle. Edom would be coming up from below. So you figure this is kind of a way of coming through that territory. We would get the understanding that they would have gone and traversed under the Dead Sea and then come up from the south. They pick up along the way. They have the king of Edom as a part of their group of kings. So we'll look at this when we get into 2 Chronicles and we study a little bit more about Jehoshaphat. What we know of him and the things that there is of this, God sees him as a good man, a godly king. His horrible, horrible blind spot is he goes outside of the southern tribe of Judah, and he makes alliances that he should never make. Whether it was with Ahab or whether it is with his son Jehoram, these are wicked people that God would not want him to be a part of, and yet God does bless these campaigns to some extent, not only with Ahab, but he will do here with Jehoram as well. And it's just, again, it's a case study in a person who could be right as far as God is concerned, but not paying attention to the finer, smaller things. Does God want him to have interaction with this? None of this is ever seemingly prompted by God, but God does give him favor for sake of who he is, it would appear, and because in most of what he does, this is a godly man, but really, really bad as far as his interactions with other people. He should not have business with these people. And again, we'll pick that up when we get into 2 Chronicles. So it tells us, so King Jehoram went out, mustered all of Israel, got in touch with Jehoshaphat, verse 7, and Jehoshaphat says, my people are as your people. How should we go? We're going to go up through Edom. So verse 9. So the king of Israel went with the king of Judah and with the king of Edom, and they marched on the roundabout route 7 days, and there was no water for the army, nor for the animals that followed them. And the king of Israel said, alas, for the Lord has called these 3 kings together to deliver them into the hand of Moab. Gosh, does this not sound like the children of Israel after the Exodus? They hit some hardship, but this would show you once again the difference between Jehoram, a man who doesn't care about the things of God whatsoever, and a guy like Jehoshaphat. Not perfect, not by a long shot, had the blind spot, and if he didn't have it, he wouldn't be in this predicament at all. But notice the reaction of these two. One complains, tries to blame God for what he sees as the misfortune. It's God's fault, it's not ours. They didn't go and seek out the Lord first in any of the details that we get here, but God meets them at their need because Jehoshaphat does the thing that's wise. So look at what happens. So, verse 11. But Jehoshaphat said, is there no prophet of the Lord here in this place, that we may inquire of the Lord by him? And so one of the servants of the king of Israel answered and said, Elisha, the son of Shaphat, is here, and who poured out water on the hands of Elijah. So there's a guy that we would know, Elisha, and we might recognize him because this is a guy who was around the whole time with Elijah. Jehoshaphat knows this, knows who these people are. So it's like, well, great, let's see what he has to say. Jehoshaphat said, the word of the Lord is with him. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom went down to him. So Elisha said to the king of Israel, what have I to do with you? That's his way of saying, what are you doing here? I have nothing to do with you. You have nothing to do with me. There is real animus between these men. Of course, why would there be? Elisha is clearly a man of God, one that God has raised up. Jehoram is a wicked king who cares nothing about the things of the Lord. Look at what he says. He goes on from here. So, Elisha said, as the Lord of hosts lives, verse 13. So Elisha said to the king of Israel, what have I to do with you? Go to the prophets of your own father and the prophets of your mother. But the king of Israel said to him, no, for the Lord has called these 3 kings together to deliver them into the hand of Moab. So once again, he's griping. It's, I'm coming to you because it's your God, basically, who's brought us to this place of judgment, and we're all going to fall at the hands of Moab. Well, Elisha said, as the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, it's his way of saying, I am his representative, so he's able to speak with authority. He said, surely, were it not that I regard the presence of Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, I would not look at you nor see you. We wouldn't be having this conversation. Now, this, again, you would think, for Jehoram, depending on what the outcome of this would be, this should give him, once again, another reason why he should just be this humble man and say, I have to forsake all that has been done by my father and by myself, because once again, the God of Israel, through the words of a prophet on behalf of a king that is godly, different than he is, Jehoshaphat's a different man entirely, you would think that after a while, sooner or later, somebody would step up and just go, yeah, maybe we've been wrong all along. Well, they don't. So, he says this, now, bring to me a musician. And then it happened when the musician played that the hand of the Lord came upon him. And so, again, why is this important? Why a musician and all the rest of it? No idea. No idea whatsoever. Was it just that it was pleasing to Elisha? Or, why was it all done this way? People can speculate all that they want to. Nobody knows. And again, it is a very odd little tidbit of information. But here's the important part. So he said, thus says the Lord, make this valley filled with ditches. For thus says the Lord, you shall not see wind, nor shall you see rain, yet this valley will be filled with water, so that you and your cattle and your animals may drink. And this is a simple matter in the sight of the Lord, for he will also deliver the Moabites into your hands. He's going to use one to do the other. Verse 19, you will attack every fortified city, every choice city. You will cut down every good tree. You will stop up every spring of water, and you will ruin every good place of the land with stones. Now, here's the important part. This is God not saying, I want you to inhabit this land. I want you to plunder it. I want you to damage it, and that would keep, for generations or for some time, somebody to reestablish anything that might come as an enemy against Israel again, because Moab will just be basically hamstrung for a very, very long time. So God says, you can take the plunder with you, but I don't want you to leave the land intact. I want you to make it difficult for anybody that tries to settle there again. Now, here's what he asks them to do. They know that there's no water. The king of Moab would know that there's no water. So why would God have them dig trenches? Twofold. We're about to see that it's going to give a visual impression of something that will lead the king of Moab to make a very bad decision, but more importantly, that dig ditches so that there's something to catch the water. I'm not going to bring rain. I'm not going to do anything that would give Moab the understanding that there is anything other than what they surmise they're about to see. I don't want them to know that there's water. And if there's a big rainstorm that would do this, that's going to make him aware. So God just says, you have to do your part. You dig the ditches. Could God have dug the ditches and done all the rest of that? Absolutely. Could he have made water, just given a depression into the ground and put water there? Of course he could. But this is an important thing, that there are times that God would have us, do you trust me? And if you trust me, then I'm going to ask you to do this. Does it make sense? Not always. In this case, we can understand why digging ditches is a good thing. We can understand that it would be a place to catch water. It would be good for the livestock that are with them, for the animals that are with them, and for the men. They'll have a source of water. That was the problem. But God has them participate in it rather than just do all the work for him. So it's a good thing that we recognize that God will say, I'm asking you to trust me, and if you trust me, you'll do these things. Now, it is highly important that we understand that this is one of those things where God is going to use the obedience of the people to do something that will have a secondary purpose. We're about to catch that. Again, just an interesting bit of history. So, verse 20. Now it happened on the morning when the grain offering was offered that suddenly water came by the way of Edom, and it filled all of them with water. So water came under miraculous means, just flowed into that valley, not because of rain, not because of wind, not because of storm. God just brought the water, and it filled everything. And when all the Moabites heard that the kings had come up to fight against them, all who were able to bear arms and older were gathered, and they stood at the border. And they rose up early in the morning, and the sun was shining on the water, and the Moabites saw the water on the other side as red as blood. For whatever reason, it gives to them the appearance. It's seen from a long ways away. So they perceive it, they see it as a color. Now, does God make it supernaturally that color? Is it something with atmosphere? It could be any number of reasons why. But to their perception, to their eyes, it looks like pools of blood. So what is water to the people on Israel's side is blood to those people who think that they're seeing what they see. And here is what they think happens. So they said, this is blood. The kings have surely struck swords, and they have killed one another. Now, therefore, Moab to the spoil. So all that we see are these massive pools, numerous pools, and they appear to them as blood. And so their deduction is, it must be that for whatever reason, on their way to us, they started to fight amongst themselves, and what we're seeing is the remnant of it, and all those dead bodies have to be there with plunder. All we see are pools of blood. Let's go take what's there of all the dead bodies. So when they had come to the camp of Israel, Israel rose up, attacked the Moabites, so that they fled before them, and they entered their land, killing the Moabites. Then they destroyed the cities. Each man threw a stone on every good place of land and filled it. And they stopped up all of the springs of water. They cut down all of the good trees, but they left the stones of Kirhath intact. However, the slingers surrounded and attacked it. So, really places that we don't know a great deal about. And really, there's not a lot of commentary that you have on this place and what actually took place there. More importantly, they were careful to do what God said. Make the land difficult to farm, throwing stones in it. Make it difficult to build, cut down the trees. Make it impossible for people to have sources of water by stopping up the ability through the wells. They'd have to go dig new wells. They would have to get rid of all the stones. They would have to wait for trees to be built or bring them in from a much further area away. So it would take a long time for people to come back to this area and to be able to inhabit it, to raise up what would be necessary as far as an army and a nation to come and rival Israel again. That was the intention. So when the king of Moab saw that the battle was too fierce for him, he took with him 700 men who drew swords to break through to the king of Edom, but he could not. So here's the calculation, and again, it only calls for speculation. Why did he go after the king of Edom? Why did he not go after the king of Israel or the king of Judah? There's speculation, maybe a combination of a couple of things. At one point, Edom and Moab were allies. We're going to see that when we get to 2 Chronicles eventually. But there's also the idea that maybe he's the weaker of the three, and these are possibilities. They're just put out as, well, it could be this, but for whatever reason, he turns his sight on, of the three kings and their people, he identifies the king there of Edom, and he takes 700 men with him. Now, when he took his eldest son, then he took his eldest son. Seeing that it was too fierce, it didn't come to it. In fact, let's read verse 26 again, because verse 27, one rolls right into the next. When the king of Moab saw that the battle was too fierce for him, he took with him 700 men who drew swords to break through the king of Edom, but they could not. So then he took his eldest son, who would have reigned in his place, and he offered him as a burnt offering upon the wall. And there was great indignation against Israel. They hated them. So they departed from him, and they returned to their own land. So, again, The battle's over. Everybody kind of goes back to their own thing. But in this case, just the sickness of this. Talk about the wickedness of man. That they would go as far as to do something like this. This man says, if the battle's going as far as it is, let me offer up in a sacrifice my son to see if this would turn the tide of the battle. Of course, it didn't. And just again, the depravity of man and the sickness of man to do the things that he does. I mean, who would ever think of that? That your last ditch effort, maybe this will work and I'm just going to sacrifice my kid on a wall as a burnt offering to my gods in hopes of turning the tide on this. Unbelievable. But again, man left to his own devices. I think it's pretty obvious that there is some deep-seated wickedness in mankind. And when you turn away from any knowledge of the God of heaven, the stuff that you will do in your own spiritual pursuit, call it whatever you want to, man, that is some rank wickedness. Chapter 4. Now, notice that it is a complete break with what we just read. I mean, it's just totally different direction. But here's what it does. Elijah shows up in chapter 3. This now turns the attention away from Jehoshaphat and Jehoram. It turns the attention towards Elijah. And again, these are just said very matter of fact. They're just there. Here's the information. But you're going to notice that there's some interesting, miraculous things that take place that have a very New Testament feel to them. And you'll notice when we get there. A certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, saying, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord, and the creditor is coming to take my 2 sons to be his slaves." So Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?" And she said, "Your maidservant has nothing in the house but a jar of oil." This sounds very reminiscent to something that Elijah did as a very similar kind of a miracle. So he said, "Now go and borrow vessels from everywhere, from all of your neighbors, empty vessels, and do not gather just a few." This is his way of saying, just bring totally empty vessels and get a bunch of them. Bring a lot of them. Now remember, whatever the jar is, whatever the size of the jar is, it doesn't matter. It could be this small, it could be this small, or this big, it could be that big. It doesn't matter. She has a certain amount of oil, and it's really all that there is to her name. It certainly isn't enough to pay off the debtor. Her husband is dead. He owned this, but they have bills, they have obligations. There's no way that they can pay for it. So Elisha says, "What would you have me to do? What do you have in your house?" She just says, "I got a jar of oil. That's the only thing of value that I have in my house." Great. Go have your kids, your boys, go have them get a bunch of these jars. Again, Elijah is not the one who said, "Let me bring some jars and we'll fix this." You participate in this. You go get jars. It's asking her to walk by faith in this. It really is. So then he said, "Now go and borrow vessels from everywhere," verse 3, "not just a few. And when they had come in, you shall shut the door behind you, you and your sons, and you will pour it into all of those vessels and set aside the full ones." Now, this is fishes and loaves kind of stuff that's going to go on here. You can already see the setup for it. So here's the picture. She has, whatever size it is, a jar of oil, and it has value, but nowhere near what they need. So he says, go get a bunch of empty vessels. Doesn't tell us how big, how many. We certainly know because of the outcome of this whole thing, it is a bona fide, crazy, over-the-top, insane miracle. And there's going to be another one of these before the chapter's over. So she went from him, shut the door behind her and her sons, and they brought the vessels to her, and she poured it out. So from her jar or her vessel into these other vessels. Now it came to pass when the vessels were full that she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And they said to her, "There is not another vessel." And so the oil ceased. The miracle comes to an end. So she pours out, whatever it is, or how big it may have been, she pours the oil out into all of these vessels. Hers never depletes. Those all fill up until they run out of vessels. And that was the end of the miraculous, where God no longer provided any further oil than what she had. So what ends up happening with it? So then she came and she told the man of God, and he said, "Now go and sell the oil, pay your debt, and you and your sons can live on the rest." That is just fishes and loaves, and you're going to have another fishes and loaves in this chapter as well. It's just, once again, miraculous. God provides over and above, and he does it at the hands of Elisha. Now, one thing that we have with Elisha that we don't have with Elijah is a lot of these kind of just quick bang, 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 miracle, 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 all these things happen. He's done the interaction with the kings in the way that Elijah did. Elijah had the miracles. He had the miracle of the oil. He resurrected a child like Elisha is going to do. So there are some parallels, but what we get from Elisha is it happens very, very quickly. We just have a lot of anecdotal bits and pieces of his history of a lot of miraculous things. So here's another one that's going to come up. Verse 8. Now it happened one day that Elisha went to Shunem, where there was a notable woman, and she persuaded him to eat food. So it was, as often as she passed by, that he would turn in there and eat some food. So he makes the circuit. He's going from place to place. There's a person who basically says, we've got a place for you. You're welcome to stay here. We'll take care of your needs, sustain you and everything else. He just sees it as a kindness, and it's presented as such. So please let us make up verse 9. She said to her husband, look now, I know that this is a holy man of God who passes by us regularly. Please let us make a small upper room on the wall, and let us put a bed in it for him, and a table, and a chair, and a lampstand. So it will be that whenever he comes to us, that he can turn in there. Let's just give him a place to stay. It'll be a normal course of things, which is really kind of a cool thing. Wouldn't it be great if you're one who knows who Elisha is, shows him kindness, and says, you always have a place at our home? Really, really cool. So it happened one day that he came there, and he turned to the upper room to lay there. And when he had said, then he said to Gehazi, his servant, call the Shunammite woman. And when he called her, she stood before him, and he said, say now to her, look, you have been concerned with us and with all of our care. What can I do for you? Do you want me to speak on your behalf to the king or the commander of the army? And she said, I dwell among my own people. It's her way of saying, I have no need of the king or of anyone else. I'm at peace. Everything's fine right here where I am. So he said, what then is to be done for her? And Gehazi answered, actually, she has no son, and her husband is old. And so he said, well, call to her. And when he called to her, she stood at the door, she stood in the doorway. And then he said, about this time next year you shall embrace a son. And she said, no, my lord, man of God, do not lie to your maidservant. She basically says, yeah, this is impossible. Why would you say something like that? Don't play that kind of a game with me. Why would you say something like that? Don't lie to me. It's impossible. She sees the impossibility of it. But the woman conceived, anyway. This has a very Abraham and Sarah kind of a feel to it. But the woman conceived and bore a son, and when the appointed time had come, of which Elijah had told her. So right on time, this time next year, you're going to embrace a son. So a year passes by, she has this son. Now, the child grew, and it happened on one day that he went out to his father and to the reapers. So they're working the field, right? And he said to his father, my head, my head. And so he said to a servant, carry him to his mother. Something has happened. There, of course, they say, is it an aneurysm? Is it something like that? Whatever the case may be, something has damaged him. Something is wrong with him physically. And we're going to see the importance or the seriousness of whatever it is that happens to him. So when he had taken him and he brought him to his mother, he sat on her knees until noon, and then he died. So the son of this promise, this welcomed child, miraculously birthed, is now dead. And so what does she do? So she went up, she laid him on the bed of the man of God, shut the door upon him, and she went out. Then she called her husband and said, please send me one of the young men and one of the donkeys, that I may run to the man of God and come back. So he said, why are you going to him today? It is neither the new moon nor the Sabbath. And she said, it is well. It's basically, He says, why don't you go on a more preferable time, or at a more preferable time? She just said, it is well. Let me go. I need to get there to him. So of course, she saddled a donkey. I'm sorry, I skipped a verse. Then she called to her husband, send me a young man and one of the donkeys, verse 23. And so he said, why are you going to him today? It's neither a Sabbath nor a new moon, verse 24. Then she saddled the donkey and said to her servant, drive and go forward. Do not slacken the pace for me unless I tell you. So you set the pace and make it fast. Go. I'll keep up. If I can't keep up, I'll let you know. But she doesn't want this to be a slow thing. She needs to get to Elisha, and she sees it, which is really an amazing thing. And I guess I could just point it out when we get there. But this has a very Mary, Martha, Lazarus, Jesus kind of a feel to it. Because you see she's driven. I'm going to get to Elisha, and I'm going to tell him what's happened. But you can see by her greeting, it's very much, why did you allow this to happen? Very much like what Martha did. Rather than just saying, look, he's a miraculous work of God that I have this son in the first place, and now he's dead. How is it that you didn't know this? And, instead she goes, you need to come because you've got to heal him. She knows Elijah did it. So, it's that time when what you believe may be possible is overridden by reality. Her son's dead. She knows it. He's laying in the bed. She's going to get, some people would say she's going to give him a piece of her mind. Is that part of it? Why would she just have not just, buried him and everything else? You can tell by her actions, it sure does seem the urgency of it is not, I just want to go yell at him. But she's going to give him a piece of her mind as she sees it. But you can see that the door is left open, that she brings this news. There has to be a hopefulness that he's going to intervene. Very, very interesting how this goes on. So, what we get in verse 25. So she departed. She went to the son, or to the man of God. She made it to Mount Carmel. And so it was, when the man of God saw her afar off, that he said to Gehazi, look, the Shunammite woman it's the Shunammite woman. We recognize her. So he says, please run and meet her and say to her, is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with your child? And she answered, it is well. She doesn't want to talk to Gehazi. She wants to get to Elisha, interestingly enough. She says, oh yeah, everything's fine for the most part. They're well. Or it is well. It is well. It's her way of just basically saying, yeah, I want to get to Elisha. So when she came to the man of God at the hill, she caught him by the feet, but Gehazi came near to push her away. But the man of God said, there's just like she comes in and lays hold of him. Gehazi comes to take her away from him, and look at what he says. Let her alone, for her soul is in deep distress, and the Lord has hidden this from me, and he has not told me. I don't know what's wrong. God has not told me this, but don't grab onto her. Don't pull her away. God has hidden this. What's going on? So she said, did I ask for a son from my Lord? Did I say, do not deceive me? So she sees this as, okay, I told you not to lie to me. You said I was going to have a son. You didn't tell me I was going to have him only for a little while. Now he's this young boy who's now dead. So she says all this. And then he says to Gehazi, get yourself ready. Take my staff in your hand and be on your way. If you meet anyone, do not greet him. If anyone greets you, do not answer him, but lay my staff on the face of the child. Again, why lay his staff on the face of the child? We can understand why. Don't get distracted. If people say something to you, just keep going. But here's my staff. Put it on his face. Why? No good reason. No good explanation. There have been a few have tried to speculate, but again, it is only speculation. And because it's just such a weird request, and it's about to get weirder, you would basically say it's not supposed to make sense to us. And even what he asks Gehazi to do, it would appear as though that's what seems right to him, but it doesn't have the immediate effect. We see this. So, and the mother of the child said, as the Lord lives, I will not leave you. And so he arose and he followed her. So it says, now Gehazi went ahead of them, laid his staff on the face of the child, but there was neither voice nor hearing. Therefore he went back to meet him and told him, saying, the child is not awakened. So what this gives us the impression is that the mother and Elisha are going to be on their way. He goes ahead, it doesn't work. He comes back to meet them, probably on the way, and nothing is going as what Gehazi would have thought was necessary. So it says, when Elisha came into the house, there was the child laying dead in his bed. Now, he wasn't sleeping, it wasn't anything else. This is intended to say he was absolutely dead. We're going to find out he was cold. He went, therefore, shut the door behind the two of them, and he prayed to the Lord. First part that he does. Lord, it doesn't tell us what the prayer is, but it is an acknowledgement of the seriousness of the matter. What do we do? Praying to the Lord. Will you heal him? Is that the question? Will you resurrect him? Was that the prayer? We don't know. He did the first thing that he should do, and that was to come before the Lord. Very instructive for any of the rest of us. So once again, we have, even in our world today, these people who claim themselves to be healing ministers and have a healing ministry, and that they're, whatever you want to call them, they're shysters. But ultimately, if this is the case, notice he's able to do miraculous things, but he doesn't do it just because he can command it to happen. This is a person that goes before God first. What do we do? Father, what would you have, as we might think of it, Father, here is the situation and it's beyond me. What would you have me to do? It would be that kind of a prayer. And then, of course, the woman is hearing this too. Whatever was said, she's privy to it. So he went in, therefore, shut the door behind the two of them, and then he prayed to the Lord. And he went up, lay on the child. He put his mouth on his mouth, eyes on his eyes, and hands on his hands. What this simply means, and again, this is one of those places. Why was it done this way? There is no good answer to this. Is this unorthodox and weird? Absolutely. Why would you do this? Here the boy is laying down. He's a child, or so it would seem, a young boy, and you would figure certainly Elisha is larger than he is, but it's face to face. It's eyes to eyes, mouth to mouth, hands to hands. So he basically lays over him. Again, why? No good reason. Similar, though, to what Elijah did, as we read in the last book. So he went up, lay on the child, and then it says in verse 35 that he returned, he walked back and forth in the house, like made a circuit. And again, he went up, stretched himself out on him, and then the child sneezed, it says here 7 times, and the child then opened his eyes. People look at the 7 times. Is it a literal 7 times? Did somebody bother counting, or was it a way of saying in a symbolic manner that it was the completeness? 7 having a very significant 7 days of completeness. That people that love to get into that numerology kind of things. What's the importance of the numbers? Sometimes that stuff gets really, really weird, and I avoid it like crazy because it calls for so much speculation. So there are two ways of looking at this. Was it 7 times that somebody counted it, or is it meant kind of in the metaphoric sense that it was complete? And how do we know that? Because the child sneezed and life came back to him. That's the important part. So it tells us he sneezed 7 times, opened his eyes. And then he called Gehazi and said, call the Shunammite woman. And so he called her. And when she came in to him, he said, pick up your son. And so she went in, fell at his feet, bowed to the ground, and then she picked up her son and went out. So it was that recognition, God has done the miraculous. Again, she would have heard the prayer, or somebody, was it reported to her? Was it just he and Gehazi? The idea that the prayer was offered, she recognizes where the miracle came from. There's no question about it. And the idea of even bowing, and obviously it was a thankfulness to him. Not much is made of the whole thing. It wasn't any kind of done in the sense of worship, or Elisha would have had to have corrected it, said don't do that. But it was that gratitude, and then she picks up her son and he's alive. So just very quickly, notice how these are given to us without any filler, without any extra information. It's just so matter of fact. But let's remember, if it was days, it would have taken days for the child to have died, for her to get from where she was, probably about 20 miles away, roughly, 20 miles to get to him, the time for the reaction to come back. The child would have been dead at minimum a couple of days. So let's stop to consider the miraculous part of this. It isn't, and it's like the same thing with Lazarus or any of the other ones that have been resurrected. Just consider the importance of this. If a person dies, we know that if they're without oxygen for any length of time, a brain will begin to decay. There'll be damage done to it, and it's irreversible. If it's more than just a matter of minutes, it becomes a real problem. If it turns out to be days, it's more than just death of the brain. The internal organs begin to rot. The body would be it couldn't sustain life. The blood would have been corrupted. I say all this just to point out what should be a very obvious thing. When this child is brought back to life, it is a God kind of creation type of making something out of nothing. There may have been a corpse there, but there was not a chance. It's not like just put paddles on him and get his heart beating. The heart would have been ruined. All of the internal organs would have rotted, been in the place of rot. There was no way to recreate them unless it was done in I shouldn't say there's no way to make them work again. They would have had to have been recreated from whole cloth, meaning God would have had to have, as he did in the very beginning, created life from non-life. There was nothing to work with here. There's the outline, the imprint of the body, but there's nothing about that body that could function again. God had to do every single, let's bring it down to the smallest level. Every molecule in that body had to be brought back from dead to life. That means recreating every organ, recreating blood, recreating brain, recreating everything in the most absolute, complete, whole way. That's the kind of miracle that we're talking about here. So when Jesus did this with Lazarus, very, very impressive, no question. But he's the Lord. He's Jesus. He can do those things. He's miraculous that way. God was doing this in the Old Testament through Elijah and now through Elisha. People that were dead for a length of time enough that there was nothing to work with. They're not going to do CPR. They're not going to resuscitate them by breathing into them. That's not going to work. This takes God recreating it at the molecular level on every conceivable way, in every conceivable way. This is miracle of miracles. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. Verse 38. So Elijah returned to Gilgal, and there was a famine in the land, and now the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, and they said to the servants, "Put on a large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets." Now, remember, at the time, if there's a famine in the land, you tend to maybe get things that you might not otherwise put into stew or something that you could eat. So we see something is brought that's foreign. So one went out into the field to gather herbs, and they found a wild vine. They gathered from it a lapful of wild gourds, and they came and sliced them into the pot of stew, though they did not know what they were. Bad idea. So they looked like something that was edible, but they weren't familiar with it. But they sliced them up nonetheless. They threw them in with the stew. Let's see what it tastes like. So they served it to the men, and it happened as they were eating the stew that they cried out and they said, "Man of God, there is death in that pot," and they could not eat it. Does that mean that people were starting to die, or is that just a way of them saying, this is poison, this is bad? Are they starting to feel the effects of it? Is it just something that tastes terribly wrong? Whatever the case may be, there's not food. There's a famine that's going on. We've taken this time to put all these things in here, and it's going to kill us. So they say to Elijah, "What are we going to do?" Look at his reasoning. So he said to them, "Bring me some flour, bring me meal." And so he put it in the pot and said, "Serve it to the people that they may eat, and there was nothing harmful in the pot." Now, is it because it was just lacking some kind of thing, and Elisha has some kind of great culinary skills? No. It wasn't that it tasted bad. It was that it was making them sick, and some even may have thought if they say death in the pot, that might be an exaggeration, or it could have been real, genuine fear. Are we going to die from eating this? So what Elijah asks them to do, again, it doesn't fix the problem if it's poison. Putting meal or flour in it isn't going to fix the problem. That only just adds more substance to it than what it had before, but it doesn't cure something that is poisonous. So again, is this God just using something, a way of doing something visible that changes the physical attributes of what was in the pot, but it has to be miraculous. Otherwise, you're just throwing flour or meal into the pot. That won't fix it. And those, again, he doesn't have to say, I'll taste it, I'll do anything else. He said, serve it to the prophets. And notice the guys who are going to eat it are having to say, okay, he's obviously done a lot of miraculous things. He's not going to do this one wrong. Remember, as we read this, we don't get any of the details. It's just said, so matter of fact, here's the problem. There's a famine. Hey, you guys got to eat. So Elijah says, make something for them. They go to gather up some things that they know are edible. They see some things in a vine with some gourds, melon kind of things, and slice it up and throw it in there. Everything's good. So these guys said, man, we put all the things in here, but something is seriously wrong with this. Death in the pot's a pretty strong phrase. And so he just says, give me some flour, throws it in there. It's okay to eat it. And these guys eat it. Everything's fine. The end. So when we look at something like that, we have to go, these are miraculous things that are said so matter of fact. And I want to make sure that we understand this too. We don't always see these kind of things in our lives. Now, this is a fascinating thing. I have met and I know a lot of people who are from the early days of what we call the Jesus movement, from the 60s into the 70s. And these people firsthand witnessed some miraculous things that you don't hear so much about anymore. Most of the stuff that we hear as miraculous is just dog and pony show crazy kind of stuff. Why are those things not happening in the same way now? And there's a lot of explanations that people have for it. The people are not really ready for such a type of a thing, or God's done doing those kind of things. It was done to give credibility in those early days, but we're past that. We now have the testimony of what had taken place. There's a lot of good explanations for it. But I do know this, when you start to talk to people who are outside of this nation, and they go into places in the world where the gospel is not a common thing, miraculous things still take place there. And then, of course, it begs the question, is that because the people are prepared for such a thing? Are they not at the point where they're so filled with knowledge and understanding that they can't even look at the miraculous as a possibility? Again, so many things that you can speculate on that, but I do find it an interesting thing. I want to make sure I understand this and believe it myself. The God who did this with Elisha is no different from the God who is working in mankind now. He's the same one. Why he does things a particular way at a particular time and differently in other times is for him to know. But he's still the God of the miraculous. And if I need no other evidence of that, the idea that a person can be taken from death to life because of faith in Jesus Christ, be indwelt by the Holy Spirit, and have the hope of heaven because of his sacrifice, that is as miraculous gets. That which is dead, which was dead, is now made alive. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1. He made us alive, though we were dead in our trespass. That's important for us to recognize if we don't see, quote, miracles like this happening all over the place. And if you're a believer, that is the biggest miracle you will ever witness, that God is able to take that which was spiritually dead, us, make us spiritually alive because of what Jesus did. Everything after that would be, I guess we could say, icing on the cake, because that miracle right there is greater than any of the other ones that you could possibly see. Even a person raised from the dead, that person will die again. That human body, if it was raised from the dead, it would die again. But if you have been brought into the newness of life spiritually, you'll never see death spiritually. So one is eternal, the other one is temporal. Let's keep that in mind. One's impressive to the eyes and to the intellect, but man, spiritually, there is nothing greater than a person that was dead to God spiritually, but now made live and animated before that same God, and they know him and he knows them. That's miraculous. Verse 42. Then a man came from Baal Shalisha and brought the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley, a newly ripened grain in his knapsack, and he said, "Give it to the people that they may eat." Now, this was just a man who brought a small amount. It's a time of famine. Here's a way where this time of famine can be seen in the miraculous sense. It's like what just happened with the oil in the previous chapter. This is fishes and loaves kind of stuff. Bringing something that was good, it was new, it was fresh, it was great, but there's a famine in the land. So here, it's brought to Elisha, as we see. A man came and he brought the man of God, that's Elisha, bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley bread, newly ripened grain in his knapsack, and he said, give it to the people that they may eat. But his servant said, what, shall I set it before 100 men? And he said again, give it to the people. That's not just 100 men. Basically his point is, it's like when the report was to Jesus, what do we have here to eat? There's thousands of people. What do we have? A couple of fish and some loaves. Okay. What are we supposed to do with that? Well, go ahead and give it to the people. Have them sit down in their 50s and give it to them. But there's not enough. So we know the rest of the story. All those thousands of people ate what was enough for a kid, and they had to pick it up in 12 baskets to get the remnants of what was left over. It was miraculous. God expanded it. Here, the same exact thing. His servant said, what, shall I set it before 100 men? And he said, no, give it to the people, that they may eat, for thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left over. So let's remember, when we see the fishes and loaves, in this case, absent the fish, we have the exact same thing here. And who is it that's credited with it? The Lord. It's not Elisha. It's that God moves on Elisha to say, do this, and then God is the one who backs it up and causes the miracle to take place. And so he set it before them, and they ate, and they had some left over in accordance to the word of God, or to the word of the Lord. Once again, no mystery. It is just, it's miraculous, but it's not a mystery. At the time God is establishing there in the north, even in the midst of all of the wickedness of the kings, God is giving to the nation prophets saying and doing things that only prophets of God could do, even in the face of all of the wickedness. If nothing else, this was done for the sake of the accountability among the people. They would be without excuse. They couldn't say that, well, God doesn't do anything, so we started following other gods. Look at what's happening here. So if the people continue in their rebellion, which they do, then when they stand before God someday, they won't be able to say, well, you didn't tell us. Yeah, he did. Not only did he tell you through the mouths of the prophets, he did miracles that no one else could do. And he did them in some of the most bizarre ways so that no one could ever take credit for it because it followed some formula. They were asked to do odd things. And those odd things turned out to be miraculous, and no one would be able to go, well, I can explain that away through natural means. So again, a guy brings quality food to them, but it's only enough for a handful of people. God says, no, give it to everyone, and then pick up what's left over. Okay, that's ridiculous. Not if you're not if you're God, it's not ridiculous. In fact, it's miraculous, and no one could ever take credit for it. Same things with the other miracles that we see here. They're not supposed to make sense. Not to our intellect, not to our mind, not to our common sense. They're supposed to say he uses things that don't make any sense so that man could never take credit for them. Whether it's Old Testament or New Testament, we have so many examples of such things. All that to say, we need to recognize, whether we see it or not, our God is the God of supernatural things. He is the God of the miraculous. We don't have to see these things that sometimes we see in the scriptures. Again, if you're a believer, look at yourself in the mirror, and that is the biggest miracle that you will ever see. Please understand that. Can God heal like he did in these times? You bet. He can do whatever he wants to. He created everything here. It is subject to him. He is free to do whatever he wants to do. Why don't we see as much of it? Hard to say. A lot of different speculations, but I don't walk by sight anyway. When you hear the Bible say that we walk by faith and not by sight, just remember sight is one of the senses. It's better for us to understand, we could expand that. We walk by faith and not by sensual things. Not by what we hear, not by what we see. It's not by the sensory things. We believe what we believe based upon faith, and that faith is based upon the one who has made promises, and we believe his promises because he's made so many of them and he's never failed. So this is why we are able to say, I have confidence that when God says something, I can put my faith in it because he is so worthy of my trust, unlike any other. So for the believer, it is really cool that we have these things recorded for us. Is it our history? No, it's the history of Israel. Are we under their covenant? We're not under their covenant. It's the Old Testament. We're studying through the book of Galatians on our Thursdays. And Paul is very, very clear about making sure that we don't walk according to the law, but the law had its purpose. The law was going to give us do's and don'ts that would show to us that we're sinners, but we need something else. It brings us to the person of Jesus, the one that we cry out to and say, the one thing the law couldn't do about our sin, you have done for us. And we put our trust and our faith in what he has done. He is the ransom. He is the payment. He is the sacrifice for our sin in his blood. So with all that being said, all of this so points forward to a time that it would give precedent to the important things that we saw. So the people in Israel, when they saw Jesus doing the fishes and the loaves, and when they saw him doing miraculous things of making things there that weren't there before, or raising the dead, they were able to say, there were those men before who did such things. And now we see this man doing the exact same things, and they begin to hear his message. And his message is different than it's ever been before, because now he's starting to pronounce to them the kingdom of God. So again, the compatibility of the Old Testament and the New cannot be overestimated. It cannot be it's not exaggerated. We must realize they are totally compatible because one is foreshadowing the other. So with that, I pray that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions on any of what's been shared in this, contact us through the ministry website. It is at the end of this video, or oldpaththeology.net is our website. There's an email link there, and you can send us an email if you have any questions. And I look forward to it. If you do correspond with us, I love being able to have interaction with the people who watch. Let us know what you think of the channel. If you're watching this on YouTube, if you haven't subscribed to it, please do so. Just hit the subscribe button, and it'll advise you and let you know when new content comes up. So with that said, we'll pick up at chapter 5 next week, and I pray it's been a blessing to you.